I wanted to kind of follow up on this morning is kind of looking at what are some of the problems with this kind of ideal of transferring technology, of ensuring that in order for a region or a community or a country to become developed, they must adopt universally and as quickly as possible every technological improvement, right? So that's kind of one of the ideals today that guides many people in the technology industry or in the development industry. And I'm going to make the case and the argument that that is a faulty approach, and that we should return to kind of this ideal of the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and even early into the 90s of appropriate technology, right? Of regaining a sense of autonomy to really decide and allow small scale communities to decide what types of technologies they should adopt and what types of technologies might not be helpful and they should avoid. Instead of just pushing this transfer, this adoption without any sort of kind of questioning of that, we should look at how we can really allow certain technologies to empower local communities, especially given all of the different uh, crises and vulnerabilities that kind of define this current age of modernity in which we are living. Talking about economic vulnerabilities, all of the ecological and environmental crises that we are facing that are only going to become much more severe in the coming years, coming decades. So how can communities empower themselves to choose which technologies will be useful and beneficial without simply disrupting traditional patterns of life in the adoption of new technologies? So I chose for the subject or the title something that I think is, well, provocative, maybe is the word to use, is the idea of intentional inefficiencies. And I don't know if that makes any sense to you all, but it's a term that I came across in studying the work of David Fleming, he was an alternative economist from the UK who spent a lot of time in India and other parts of the world working with small scale communities. He was very big on the idea of appropriate technologies, of communities having the power and the wisdom and the autonomy to decide which technologies to adopt and which to avoid. And he had this idea that what most modern day technology does is seek to impose efficiency above everything else. And today, most people, when they hear the term efficiency, it's automatically assumed to be something better, something that we should always seek, right? Efficiency in more comfort, efficiency in more economic ease, efficiency in less physical labor, efficiency in how we generate our electricity and our energy and our power. Everybody talks about energetic efficiency when it comes to homes, to automobiles, to powering electrical grids. And David Fleming, we're gonna look at his work, said efficiency can play an important role, but when it comes to technology, sometimes adopting or allowing for inefficiency is going to be the best way to respond to the crises that we face. And that when I first read that, that was something that seemed so counterproductive, or it definitely going against the current and the grain of our modern day society, which everything is oriented towards this idea of technique, of technical efficiency, right? So the outline of the class is I want to start with a standard critique of technology. This is something that there's been several philosophers and anthropologists and others who have looked at how humanity and how modernity relates to technology. And I'm going to talk a little bit about Jacques Ellul, was a famous kind of anthropologist and philosopher who wrote a lot about this critique of technology, along with Marshall McLuhan. So I want to follow those two thinkers while we kind of adopt a critique of technology. And I think that's important today because in this age of rapid technological improvement or rapid technological innovation, most people kind of assume that technology is our ally in every case, that new technologies are always going to be beneficial, are pushing humanity forward in our quest for progress and advancement and things like that. And I think we need to take a moment to stop and question that, and allow a sense of doubt and a sense of critique, to kind of inform how we relate and how we organize our lives around the technologies that are continuously being imposed upon us by states, by economic entities, by private corporations. to kind of retake a sense of autonomy over that. So I want to start with this, with critiquing technology, which I think is very lacking in today's world. So start with a critique of technology, and then make the case that the adoption and the spread and the growth of technology itself is completely dependent on energetics, on an abundance of energy. And I want to make the case that one of the problems in the development world of encouraging small scale communities around the world, whether it be, small farming communities in Central America or marginalized urban communities in certain big metropolises around the world, or a hunting and gathering community somewhere in Africa, whatever the case may be, by only saying that the best way to develop is to adopt these technologies, we're kind of blinding ourselves to the reality that that by depending more on technologies that in turn depend on an enormous amount of energy is putting people in a place of increasing vulnerability. And then I want to take a look, like I said, David Fleming, the author I mentioned, the economist, take a look at his what he says about intentional inefficiencies and intentional waste. How throughout history communities have adopted certain strategies and behaviors that allowed for inefficiencies, that was not trying to continuously kind of improve their lot, or improve their progress, but adopt a certain level of stagnation, I guess is the word you could use, as we sought to fit into our places. And lastly, make a few connections directly to the world of development, hopefully with some questions. I have more questions than answers in most of these things, but that's kind of how I want to start. So let's start real quick with a standard critique of technology. Today, I think it's fair to say we live in a technopoly, right? A society in which the most powerful technologies have come to dominate people who they're supposed to serve. And they reshape us in their image. That's a big one. A lot of times, the idea that we have, or the kind of the theme that most of big governments and technological corporations want to sell us is that we control these technologies and they're here to serve us and help us create this kind of utopian world in which we're going to live, this utopian society. What I think really happens, as most evidence and data points to, is that as we adopt these technologies, they reshape us in their image, right? So the picture here, you can talk all about all of the benefits of smartphones and how they connect people and how they make life easier. But at the same time, what you see with young people around the world is an addiction, that people can't live without their phones. People can't live without their GPS systems, without the technology, without the connectedness. And at the end, because of this dependency, that the tool itself shapes us into its image. These technologies, therefore, might be called prescriptive, something that we require. Today I'm actually visiting my family in the United States, and the other day I went to renew my driver's license. Just because to be able to drive around and get around here in the United States, and I couldn't do so without an app on my phone. I don't have a phone. I'm one of the few who's held out of the smartphone revolution. So it's kind of like, well, if you want to have a driver's license, you have to adopt this technology. So it's prescriptive. It's manipulatory in the sense that it requires people to follow certain algorithms. I mean, that's all of the things you can say about how algorithms of social media, of artificial intelligence systems reshape us into their image. Social networks, for example, promise to forge connections, but they also encourage mob rule. Facial recognition software, which is being widely pushed around the world, supposedly can help to identify suspects and criminals in this. But at the same time, it allows governments and corporations and powerful actors in society to essentially have a ubiquitous surveillance on every person at every time. So collectively, I mean, a lot of people criticize, certain technologies within the technopoly, right? So certain excesses, certain technologies that some people that think might be a little bit predatory or invasive. But as a whole, this widespread adoption of technology, this dependency on technological means, constitutes a paradigm which in turn produces a culture of compliance, right? So today, even though we might criticize, increasing surveillance by the state, increasing surveillance by Facebook and Twitter and all of these big companies, most people don't do anything about it, right? Every time we use our phone, we're being spied upon. People, adopt all of these new technologies into their home through these smart home technologies, and it's a culture of compliance, and with very, very, like I said, very, little ability to criticize and think independently and autonomously about which technologies to adopt and which to avoid. This is Jacques Ellul. He was, like I said, he was a famous French philosopher, thinker, and one of the main critiques of this idea of technopoly, of the dominant kind of acceptance of technology, and how this myth of efficiency. So everything we do today, every decision that society makes is about how to make life more efficient, how technologies can replace human connections, how we can come to depend individually on our technologies as it replaces every other kind of social glue that used to hold people together. So this is something these are quotes from Jacques Ellul's book. He wrote a book called The Technological Society. And so he said the technopoly in which we live today operates under a value system that Ellul called technique. That's a French word. And he said it's not just technology. It's not just like the smartphones and the computers we use, but it's the totality of methods rationally arrived at and having absolute efficiency for a given stage of development in every field of human activity, right? So it's this idea that every technology should come to replace human interaction, human physical labor, whatever it might be, as we try and make things easier, more efficient, less human involvement. And by adopting that mentality and that kind of idea of how society should be functioned, we're fundamentally changing this milieu, which is another word for environment, or this place of habitation, this new and specific environment in which man is required to exist. And he said that this technopoly, which is the word he used, is very artificial. It's obviously as technologies come to overtake human beings, we have less and less direct contact with the natural world. Even people, for example, farmers in most of the developed nations today, never touch the soil, right? The people who drive machines, these massive combines. A lot of times, technology such as drones are being used to seed fields or whatever it be, but we don't have any sort of direct connection to the natural world and to the productive nature of the systems that support life, right? Most of us no longer grow our own food. We don't source our own water. We don't cut down trees to fuel, to cook our food or to heat our homes, whatever it might be. But this new kind of technopoly is also autonomous with respect to values, ideas, and the state. It is self-determining. It's a closed circle. Like nature, it is a closed organization which permits itself to be determinative independently of all human intervention. It's kind of this idea of technology creating its own value system that self-perpetuates. It grows according to a process which is causal and not directed to ends. It is formed by an accumulation of means which have established primacy over the end, and all of its parts are mutually implicated to such a degree that it is impossible to separate them or to settle any technical problem in isolation. That's what Ellul said is what the technopoly was. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this out of the way. So the question is, if we are continuously dominated by this idea of efficiency, which comes through the adoption of technologies which replace human intervention in communities, human intervention in the production of our needs, what to do? And this is again from Ellul. He says the proper response to this situation is not to shun technology, because as human beings, we are intrinsically and necessary users of tools. If you look at from an evolutionary perspective, we are a fairly unimpressive mammal, right? Descended from apes and monkeys and whatnot. And we're not really that interesting, right? We don't have big claws, we don't have big teeth, we're not particularly good hunters, we can't climb trees like other animals. From an evolutionary perspective, we probably should have gone extinct a long time ago. What happened is that because we have our brains and our opposable thumbs, we're able to manipulate our environment in order to survive. That's what human beings do. We create environments, we change things, kind of like beavers. Beavers change the course of rivers through creating dams. We do that times 1,000. And over the years, our technologies, which have allowed us to manipulate the world for our own ends, for our own culture, for our own well-being, have drastically increased in power and in the ability. And in that process, we have also separated ourselves from the laws of nature, from the natural functioning order of nature. So rather, instead of saying that we need to shun all technology, We have to find and use technologies that, instead of manipulating us, serve sound human ends. In the past class, I used this definition from the low to try and define what appropriate technology is. Appropriate technology is not about allowing technologies to manipulate us. It's not about adopting universal adoption of every new technological means that comes onto the market, but thinking, right? Using our head, using our minds to think about what technologies are going to be helpful, what we can use, how can we decide which technologies might be beneficial and which technologies are going to be harmful. A table, for example, is a human technology, and it becomes a center for family life, a place where we can come together as a family, share meals, discuss things. A musical instrument skillfully played enlivens those around us. That's another example of a human technology. So healthy technologies might be referred to as holistic or convivial. We've talked a lot about Ivan Illich in past classes, a famous Austrian philosopher and thinker, and he used the term convivial as technologies that bring humans together, right? Not necessarily the technologies that separate us into atomistic individuals, each kind of doing their own thing, but technologies that allow human beings to come together as communities, as families, whatever it might be, because they fit within the human life world and enhance our relations with one another and augment human autonomy. Our task then is to discern those tendencies or affordances of our technologies, and on both social and personal levels, choose the holistic and the convivial ones. I'm going to make the argument that that's exactly what appropriate technology is. Instead of using this idea of technological transfer, which is essentially just imposing or telling small scale communities around the world that your best bet to overcome poverty, to overcome inequality, is to try and fit in, right? To try and fit into this technopoly as much as possible, to exploit the technologies, to try and get rid of every cultural aspect of your placedness of the communities where you were forged, and adopt new technologies and try to fit into the world economic and global economic system in which we're living. But no, appropriate technology is about deciding on both social and personal levels which technologies are holistic, convivial, and can allow for human flourishing, and most importantly, that augment this idea of human autonomy, of having the ability to decide, right? How to do this. That's the problem. One of the things that I think is that we lack the ability to discuss, to debate, to think about technology, because it's so widespread, because we live in this era of technopoly, of technique, where every decision that we make is based on how to make things more efficient, more easy. And because of that, technologies are designed to do that. So people, without thinking, kind of in a manipulatory tone, just accept every technology that comes to them. And I think one of the few remaining examples around the world of a group of people, a community, a culture of people who have maintained this resistance to the technopoly through maintaining the ability to decide and to think and to ponder over which technologies to accept and which not to accept, are the Amish. I don't know if you all are familiar with the Amish, but I grew up here in Kentucky, where I'm visiting my family right now. And around this kind of rural area of Kentucky, there's hundreds of Amish communities. So the Amish, for those who don't know, are a kind of a religious group and an ethnic group that came. They originally lived in Europe, and they left Europe about 300-400 years ago due to religious kind of intolerance of the time, and they came to the United States, and they formed small-scale agrarian communities. But one of the things that's fascinating about the Amish today is, even 300-400 years later, you see them, and most of they don't speak English as their first language. They still speak a dialect of Old German, so not even German, modern day German, but an old dialect of German. Most of them it's very visible their difference in how they dress. One of the main differences is most of them do not accept motor vehicles, or so you still see them in these kind of horse and buggies. And so a lot of people have this idea that the Amish they reject all sorts of technology, that the Amish are this kind of weird kind of religious sect that think that technology is devilish or diabolical or whatever it might be. But that's not the case at all. One of the things that's interesting about them is every year, Amish communities come together. They're a small scale community of 100, 200, 300 people. And every year they come together in this kind of town hall meeting, and they talk and they discuss about which technologies they think they should accept and which they should avoid. And they make this decision based on how technology is going to uh, affect their local communities, how it's going to how it could potentially benefit them, but also how it might cause them harm. Right. So they discuss, they discern, they decide together which technologies to admit into their communities and families and culture, and which to avoid. And it's not just one of the problems today is that we tend to only look on the positive side when it comes to technologies. We think, oh, if we all use smartphones, then it's going to make things much more efficient. We'll be able to communicate better. We'll be able to do our banking, to do our finances, to do our everything, right? And so we look at the positives. But they also said that the Amish take the time to think, what are the drawbacks, right? What are we going to gain? What could we gain by using certain technologies? But what also is going to be lost? And one of the things that's fascinating is the vast majority of Amish communities continue to avoid using electric or vehicles, cars or trucks. And you think about the why is that? And they make it this kind of economic kind of analysis. They look in our communities. One of the main drivers of employment is people who raise horses. There are certain members in the community who train horses, others who raise them and then sell them to others in the community. There's other people who grow hay to sell to people who have those horses. And then there's a whole construction industry around people who make the horse and buggies and the wheels and maintain those things. And the community rightly says the moment that we decide to change over and no longer no longer rely on horse and buggies as a means of transportation, and we adopt individual cars, young people in our community are going to lose an enormous amount of employment, right? And the same thing was around electricity. Most Amish families do not have any sort of electricity in their homes. And the idea is that if you depend on electricity in the homes, then as soon as you allow electricity into the homes, every person's going to want to have their own private computer. Everybody's going to have a TV in their room, and this dynamic of family belonging, of discussing, is quickly destroyed and is quickly lost. And so that's something that's, I think, very damaging. And the Amish say we think that belonging to community, belonging to family is something that's important. And we're going to do our best to maintain that. However, as you see in this picture, lots of Amish communities have started allowing solar energy in their barns, where they do a lot of work. They're very great craftsmen. They do a lot of kind of like furniture making. And so I said, yeah, we can allow certain small scale levels of technology through the adoption of electricity, so that we can be a little bit more efficient in the production of our furniture and our businesses, etc. What I think is important about this example is, at the very least, whether you're in agreement with the Amish or not in agreement with the Amish, if you think it's silly that they continue to use horse and buggies and they don't have lights in their houses, at the very least, it's an example of a community that comes together to discuss, to discern, to decide, to debate, all of these words that start with D, in which most of us today have completely lost it. Most communities, most individuals, most families, nobody discusses whether we should adopt technologies or avoid them. And one of the reasons that we do that, and this is following the standard critique of technology, is this idea that the medium is the message. There's a famous book written back in the 1960s by Marshall McLuhan, which says Understanding Media, the Extensions of Man. And he writes that the medium is the message. And what does that mean? He says that the medium, which is another word for technology, rather than the content it carries, shapes and influences our perception, our cognition, and our social organization. We shape our technologies, and then they shape us. So it's not how you, what McLuhan is saying here is that it's not how you use the technology, right? It's the use of the technology itself. So going back to the cell phone, a lot of parents these days are worried about limiting the screen time of their children, right? Saying we're going to let our children use tablets and computers and phones, but we're only going to allow them, an hour a day or 2 hours a day or whatever it might be, or we're going to limit what websites they can visit and what websites not. And McLuhan says that really isn't important. What's important is the moment that you begin to use a technology, it starts to shape our perceptions, right? And it's because what we know about the world, we know through our senses, what we see, what we hear, what we taste, what we touch. And technologies act kind of like a mediator, right, between us and the natural world. It creates a new environment. So the technologies in the media that we use fundamentally alter the way that we perceive and interact with the world. McLuhan posits that different media and technologies, whether they're extensions of our bodies, our senses, or even our cognitive abilities, rearrange our relationship with time, space, and other people. This is a quote from his book. He says, man becomes, or the human being becomes, as it were, the sex organs of the machine world, as the bee of the plant world, enabling it to fecundate and to evolve to ever new forms. The machine world reciprocates man's love by expediting his wishes and desires, namely in providing him with wealth and comfort and efficiency. So it's this idea that this technopoly is overcoming us. And the moment that we start to adopt a certain technology, especially when we do so without thinking, without debating, as the Amish example, we are putting ourselves in a situation where the machine world, the technological milieu, the technological environment is going to determine who we are, how we consider ourselves, our relationships with the natural world, our relationships with the social order in which we live. So that's the standard critique of technology. One that I think is urgent, this idea that the technopoly shapes us, right? It's not that technologies are not here to serve us, but we are here to serve them. And I think that is very important for us to think about that, because we have lost the ability, I think collectively, to kind of autonomously determine our relationship with the technologies we use, right? Because it's becoming so important, supposedly, to the world in which we live. And I believe in human autonomy, especially when we talk about what is good human development. What is community development about? It's about giving people the ability to shape their own future, to decide how they're going to shape their futures, right? And I think we do that through allowing discussion, allowing debate, allowing ourselves to think about what type of technologies to accept and which to avoid. So that's a standard critique of technology. The second part of this critique that I mentioned in the introduction is that this growth and development of technologies today is completely dependent on growth in the energy sector, right? You can't continue to have more technological development without more energy development. And I want to show a series of graphs here, which I think are interesting. So in the past 200 years, the power, scope, and scale and disturbance of our technologies has experienced an explosion of exponential growth due to the one-time bonanza of fossil fuels. It's become popular in lots of anthropological sectors, a lot of authors who are writing kind of this long-term view of human history that make the case that what really began to change humans' relationship with the natural world happened with the agricultural revolution 200 or 10,000, 8 to 10,000 years ago. And obviously that was a big break when we went from hunter and gatherers mostly to settled communities, the beginning of the state. But one of the things you see is that most of the graphs that look at changes in population, in resource use, in all of these different aspects of society, you see relative stability followed by a drastic kind of geometric exponential growth. These are referred to as hockey stick graphs. I don't know if you probably don't play much hockey in African countries, but it's a stick that goes very level, and then the steep upward curve. And these are called kind of hockey stick graphs or hockey stick growth patterns, right? And so what you see is that there's a relative stability in everything. This first graph here is looking at, for example, the stability of climate. So even though there's minor dips and falls over the past 1,000 years, what you see is in the last 200 years, there's this drastic growth. So we live in the age of hockey stick graphs, describing a trend that has been flat and stable for a very long time, but then shoots up at the end of series in dramatic fashion. So we can talk about this in everything, whether it be population, resource use, global temperature. On here, I want to give a few examples, right? This is human population, right? So from the year 1000, we're well below 500 million people. By the year 1800, we've grown to about 1 billion people. So it took 850 years, more or less, to grow, to double. And then from the year 1800 to the year now, you see this drastic growth. Now we're approaching 8 billion people, and we're continuing to go up to about 10 billion people by the year 2050. The same thing we see in terms of gross world product. So economic figures, how much economic activity there is around the world. Economic activity is virtually non-existent, or at least very, very stable, for up until about 1850. And then all of a sudden we see this drastic growth. And this is, again, this hockey stick type of dynamic. So what happened around this point in the graph? As you'll see, all of these moments of growth really start to take off around between the years 1800 and 1850. Here's another one about gross world product. Again, another economic figure. Here's one looking at global energy usage. So looking at, whether it be energy from biomass, or like burning wood, and then to coal, to nuclear power, whatever it might be. You see this enormous growth in energy, again, starting right around the year 1800, 1850. We can look at that in terms of the annual CO2 emissions, talking about climate change. There's a relative enormous stability over thousands of years about how much carbon dioxide is released into the air, how much is accumulating in the atmosphere. And then again, around 1900, it takes off. Extinction rates for birds, mammals, amphibians, we see the same thing. There's always extinctions going on. It's part of that dynamic of evolution. But something happened, drastically changed again around the year 1800, 1850. There's this drastic increase and an expected continuous increase in the years to come. You can also see what's considered to be the kind of the alternative or opposite hockey stick graphs, which show a drastic decline, again, starting around the same period. So here, this graph here is looking at forest cover as a percentage of land mass around the world. So from 1800 to 2000, or from the year 1000 to year 1800, you see a relative stability and then a drastic decline. The mass of land mammals, so wild animals that we know of, relative stability and then a drastic decrease. So what happened? And if we look at all of these graphs, everything starts to change, whether it be the downward trends or the upward trends, around the same time period in human history, between 1800 and 1900. So what happened? And most people are in fair agreement that it's what's considered the carbon pulse. So if we look at the carbon pulse, it's the amount of fossil fuels, the amount of carbon dioxide that we're releasing in the environment. And that is essentially non-existent, right, throughout history, throughout recorded human history. And then there's this drastic spike, right? And most people in economic circles today kind of assume that this spike, this upward trend we see here, will continue indefinitely, right? But what we see throughout history, whether you look at the rise and fall of past civilizations, whether you look at it from a biological lens of species rising and falling, nothing continues upward indefinitely, right? That's a law of nature. It's a law of common sense. And so we're living in what many people refer to as the carbon pulse, a one-time massive consumption of fossil hydrocarbons at a pace millions of times faster than they were created. It took millions of years for the oil and the carbon, the coal, the natural gas that fuels our society. It took sometimes billions of years for that to be created, and we're using it up at a pace millions of times faster than it was created. The other thing that's important is that 1 barrel of oil has the same amount of energy of up to 25,000 hours of hard human labor. That essentially means that the average American person has somewhere between 200 to 8,000 energy slaves working for them. In Africa, it's around 20 to 50. In Latin America, it's between 50 to 100. Obviously, there's an inequality in the use of this carbon pulse, which we've discussed in past classes. But all of these upward trends that we see here, in terms of human population, economic activity, energy usage, annual CO2 emissions, etc., all of that is dependent upon this pulse, this one-time drastic use of energy, which we found. It's a one-time bonanza, boom of economic growth that cannot continue. So the conundrum, the question that we have is this growth of technology as well also correlates to that. If we look at the amount of technologies that the average human being uses over the past 150 years, we'll see that is directly related to this upward growth as well. So the question that we have, the conundrum that we have, is that by the very use of certain technologies, our perceptions, our cognition, the forms of social organization which we're using are altered in terms of the scale, pace, and pattern of our lives and livelihoods. The carbon pulse of the past 2 centuries has drastically increased our power while simultaneously technology in which we live. However, these tools and the materials and the energy from which they come are not guaranteed to remain viable and available long term. How then might we begin the process of freeing ourselves from the enchantment of the technopoly and rediscovering the sense of autonomy
over our tools. Again, using the word of Ivan Illich, how can we return to a sense of conviviality, right? Of deciding which tools are beneficial and which are dependent on this one-time carbon pulse, which will eventually end. And in the world of community development, how can we empower communities to make wise decisions about which technologies are going to be helpful to them over the long term? So to start to answer, again, I don't think that there's any one answer to these questions, but I think these are very important questions that we need to be asking of ourselves, asking of the communities where we work. And I want to kind of offer one kind of pathway forward, which again is returning to the work of David Fleming. He talked about this idea of intentional inefficiency. Jack Ololages says that modern technology has become a total phenomenon for civilization, the defining force of a new social order in which efficiency is no longer an option, but a necessity imposed on activity. Again, within the technopoly in which we live, we're almost forced to adopt whatever might be, most efficient. People in the United States, without a vehicle to make drive or make transportation or human movement supposedly more efficient, are essentially kind of evaporated from the social scene, right? This has helped to drive the techno explosion, but it is founded on the assumption of unlimited energy, right? This idea that we're always going to have, that this carbon pulse in which we're living to continue an upward trend forever and ever. If we accept that that's not the case, if we accept that there has to be a downward trend in the use of, again, all of these, in the use of, obviously, of energy, and the use of economic activity, in obviously in CO2 emissions, then we have to adopt our technologies to understand that there is going to be an energetic descent, right? By simply adopting these technologies, which require ever more energy, we're putting ourselves in a place of massive vulnerability, I would say. So, what to do? David Fleming, like I said, he coined this term intentional inefficiency, which for most people is kind of like an opposite. They're opposite terms. You would never choose inefficiency. We're supposed to always work towards greater efficiencies. And he said that that throughout history, this idea of adopting intentionally inefficient practices, whether it be in agriculture, whether it be in economic activities, whether it be in demographics, is something that has always defined human populations throughout the past. So here's a quote from his book. His most famous book is called Lean Logic. And he says, many past civic societies have in fact made efforts with varying success to block further growth and increasing dependency on technologies by setting limits to working time, requiring producers to maintain intentionally inefficient practices, or by preventing the expansion of growth capital by means of intentional waste. And when we hear that, we think that, well, that's economically stupid. That's ignorance. Why would people do that? We're supposed to always increase our growth, increase our opportunities, use technologies to improve our lot in life. But what Fleming says is that, no, if you look at history, there's always been communities that made wise decisions about limiting growth through the adoption of intentional inefficiency. One of the examples that I've seen, continue to be practiced today is when I lived in Guatemala. There were these beautiful communal forests above the communities. There were these kind of collective lands that everybody owned together, and that's where the communities received their water. There were lots of springs, rivers were born out of these mountains, out of these forests, and nobody was allowed to individually own these forests. It was something that was collectively owned. However, most people in rural Guatemala continue to cook and heat their homes with wood. So people needed access to wood. Obviously, the majority of homes that were built in these communities, small Mayan communities, were made from wood. So people also relied on the forest for building homes, for getting lumber to build the homes. But one of the rules that these communities had kind of implemented was that if you're going to go into the forest, whether it be to make your own firewood or cut down a few trees to make some lumber, you can do that, but you have to use handheld tools. They did not allow any sort of chainsaws or these big logging mills that you can take into communities. That wasn't allowed. And the idea was that, obviously using a chainsaw to cut down a tree is much more efficient in terms of effort and hours and things like that. Yeah, but they said if you're going to do that, you're going to have to take your axe, you're going to have to take your saw, And you can go and you can take as much wood you need for your home, as much wood as you need for your for building your home, but you have to do it with manual physical labor. That's an example of an intentional efficiency, right? Of implementing certain practices to conserve the natural world, in this case, the communal forest, through imposing limits on technologies. And one of the reasons that these communities still have these beautiful, pristine forests, that are a haven for wildlife, that are offering all these ecological services that protect the rivers and the springs that give these communities these water, is because they have not allowed technological efficiency to take over. They've put limits on technology. In the market economy in which we live today, that's not what happens. It depends on taut competitive pricing to maximize efficiency, to allow technologies to come in to make economic growth as efficient as possible, right? I think another important example of intentional efficiency is the Old Testament kind of idea of the Sabbath, right? So in the Hebrew and the Israeli culture, historically, there was this idea that you can work hard, 6 days a week, but you can't work the seventh day. Let's at least leave one day for rest, one day to allow the natural world to kind of recover. And then another kind of example of this ancient Israeli kind of economic law is the law of Jubilee, which said that every 50 years, all of the accumulation that individuals have made would return to their owners. So there's this idea that you can work hard for 50 years, for a generation or two, and you can start to accumulate. But after that, all of the land, all of the resources are going to go back to their original owners. And that's an economic prescription of technological advancement, saying there's no reason, to work hard, to work so much harder than your neighbors. You're not going to try and increase your lot if you know that in 50 years everything's going to be taken from you and given back to the original owners. That's another example of intentional efficiency, of intentional waste, of putting limits on technological growth. Fleming says that intentional waste is the deliberate destruction of goods, or the production of goods and events which use up a lot of labor but are of no practical value in the economic sense of accumulating surplus. It has been widely practiced in traditional societies and in some form, and in most societies, with the partial but significant exception of our own. And so he looks at, for example, in the medieval times in Europe, there was an enormous amount of festivals. The average medieval peasant, in 1400, say, enjoyed more days off of work, but like 2 or 3 times more festival days than we do today. Most people today, if they're lucky, get 2 or 3 weeks of vacation time each year, whereas the peasant in medieval Europe, at least 3 or 4 months of the year were dedicated to festival times, kind of following the Catholic liturgical calendar. And one of the reasons for so much festival that he postulates is that this idea of festival and feast was used to use up the economic surplus, right? So we used festival as a means of intentional waste, to avoid accumulation, to avoid this idea of economic growth. And so this idea of intentional efficiency, in order to limit or prevent growth, capital and technology has to be controlled in one of 3 ways. One, by preventing its growth, right? So of helping people to avoid using labor intensive using technologies that make things easier and much more efficient, kind of through this idea of limiting certain technologies. So in requiring people to use axes instead of chainsaws is one example of that, right? Another way is by destroying it or discarding following growth. So again, the idea of festival, right? So when you do have, when traditional farmers had an enormous amount of ecological surplus through their farm, instead of allowing that to accumulate to spur on more economic growth, what was happening is we're going to have a major festival. It's Lenten season, it's Passover season, it's Christmas season, whatever the liturgical calendar said. It was a means for people to intentionally waste that through feasting and festival, right? Instead of allowing for private individual accumulation. And then third, by ensuring that whatever is produced, its output does not take the form of further growth capital, ensuring that surplus is wasted inefficiently and that it does not contribute to further growth. If you look at, again, that's the example of labor-intensive carnivals, but also if you look at a lot of indigenous societies throughout history, surplus, whenever there was an enormous, whether it be harvest or production of certain materials, that wealth was not necessarily used to fuel more economic growth, but through, for example, useless ornaments or even building of certain types of monuments. But these things that did not spur this need for economic growth for the technopoly of efficiency, in which we discussed earlier, right? So if growth capital is allowed unchecked, it will produce more than can be contained in a closed loop system, and the system will in due course break down. However, if part of that capital is intentionally discarded in sufficient quantity or used up in carnival and play, folly and fun, this will reduce production to a level at which can be kept within the limits of a closed loop system, making it possible that the ecosystem or community will endure, right? And so that's something that communities have always done. I think most people, when we lived in small scale place communities, understood kind of this intrinsic necessity to limit growth, right? You can't continue to have to extract from the natural world as quickly as possible and expect the equilibrium of the natural world, which sustains us, to maintain over time. You need always, to maintain this balance. And cultures throughout time created all sorts of unique responses to this, except for our own. And we live in the age of technology, where technologies are increasingly allowing us to skirt or to go around these natural boundaries of the natural world. And that's why we've seen over the past 200 years these hockey stick graphs of growth. But I think we're coming to a time when we're going to have to respond to our technologies as do the Amish, thinking about which technologies will help us to live in balance with the natural world and which are not, which are pushing us farther in the opposite direction. Real quick, kind of going over time here, I'll try and finish, but I want to make a few connections to the world of development. One of the biggest problems today is that billions of dollars of aid and development funds are destined to technology transfer, right? This idea that the widespread adoption of technologies is what we need. And what this does is it places vernacular place technologies that were carefully designed over centuries of trial and error to fit a place, culture, and a geography with an energy-intensive technologies that designed from an assumption that the growth economy will continue indefinitely. When communities, for example, lose the ability to maintain their traditional technologies and they adopt these energy-intensive technologies of modernity, we're essentially they're placing all of their chips, in betting terms, putting all of their eggs in the basket that the growth economy will continue, that this energy-intensive kind of hockey stick graph of upward trends will continue indefinitely in the future. And I think that that's probably the wisest decision to make. In this sense, the development industry is the handmaiden to the worldwide adoption of technopoly, technique, efficiency. Development and aid all too often replace the intentionally inefficient tools that were controlled by culture with surplus producing, growth-oriented, energy-hungry tools that artificially enlarge the size, scope, scale, and pace of human habitation and place. If we go back to that example of the Mayan community, it would be very easy for a development organization to come in and say, well, you all are on the poverty scale, and what we see is that you have this enormous resource of forest, right, that you all maintain. And the best way to enter into economic surplus, to improve your economic lot individually, is we're going to give out a bunch of chainsaws and logging mills, and you all can go into your forest, and then everybody can extract so much more wood that you can then sell on the market and increase your economic standing. And that's certainly one way. That's one pathway towards economic development. Then we can ask ourselves if, what would that entail in terms of ecological, in terms of environmental kind of resiliency? What would that entail in terms of living well in place over time? And I think that many times development projects tend to do that. They tend to disrupt systems that were designed carefully, by place-based cultures over thousands of years. And all of a sudden, people adopt these technologies, these energy-intensive technologies that disrupt these patterns of habitation. One can think, for example, of traditional collective hand harvesting and processing of crops versus the mechanized harvesting of industrial agribusiness, or the traditional water mill, still commonly used in villages throughout regions like the Himalayas, versus fossil fuel power mechanical mills. These traditional mills are constructed from local materials, using ancestral knowledge, communally owned, utilized, and repaired. They run on non-polluting, gravity-fed water, pollution and waste-free, operating at relatively slow speeds and low temperatures, etc. Um, and what happens today is that, you know, a development organization comes in, sees this as old-fashioned, as too hard, as difficult, and say, well, we're going to get rid of these traditional technologies and implement, electric mills or gasoline-powered mills or whatever happens. And that essentially ruins or disrupts a practice that was maybe less efficient, but certainly more well adapted to the local communities, right? So I just want to end with a few questions, right? Given what we've said about the technopoly of today, given what we've said about our inability to really think through technologies and maintain human autonomy, of community autonomy over technologies, given what we know about the carbon pulse, this one-time bonanza of energy events, which has to come to an end at some point. I want to leave you all with two questions that hopefully we can discuss a little bit. Might there be a way to reintroduce technologies of intentional inefficiency that better fit particular places? And two, how might appropriate technologies help to increase a sense of human autonomy over this sense of enslavement to the technopoly